So, joining us, and Brian, please don't take that as a sign of disrespect.
I always do.
We all know that you're at your best at 10 o'clock at
Right.
night. So, here to provide our budget update is our district's budget director, Brian Gustafson. So, welcome again, Brian.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. It's a big ask following Kate and Dwayne and John, and a lot of great things going on. Briefly, I'm going to provide sort of a preview into a preliminary budget that we'll have in front of you shortly. And I was reflecting back, and we all probably can, to times when we were students, long time ago maybe, this time of the year, that post-spring break time of the year, and how, man, that was tough. That was tough going from spring break to the end of the year. But then you get in these roles, and it's like there's just not enough time. There's just not enough time. There's so much to do and so much happening. And I think about that because here we are on April 4th. I'm going to give you a preview of some items and thinking going into the preliminary budget that's going to be in front of you in just 2 weeks. Thinking about fiscal year 24, and there's actually going to be some, albeit a draft, but some substance there in just 2 weeks. And that's fast. That's fast. So we'll jump right in. I know you still got a lot to do tonight, and you've reviewed much of this stuff already. Right? We talked to you in December, and Dave shared a lot of information in February, and just want to, in some ways, confirm some information that we've already shared, but also maybe share a little bit of new, but also reaffirm that, gosh, we're still waiting on a lot of information too. So from the revenue side of things, we're looking at three big assumptions still, right? And we're waiting for a School Finance Act, but we really still believe it will be based on an inflation rate of 8%. Okay, so that per pupil rate is typically driven by that inflation rate. And that inflation rate of 8% goes back to December of 2022 and is likely what we're going to see in our formula. Another big talking point is that budget stabilization factor. And I know that gets a lot of traction. And it's been interesting reviewing the long bill, which is making its way through its process right now. The budget stabilization factor is held constant in that long bill at $321 million. The talk all fall and even through the summer was that was going to be reduced. Well, it seems like a different mechanism coming at us for next year. The general fund is not slated to buy down that budget stabilization factor. And instead, we're likely, hopefully, going to see that buy down coming from the state education fund, which is sort of that rainy day fund for state education. It comes from income tax collections, and it's projected to get at a level of a little over $1 billion here soon. And so what we're hoping to see is still that budget stabilization factor buy down, but coming from a different source. And the information that we get is that could be anywhere from half of that, okay, for the statewide, 160 million, to maybe even all of it. I'd be surprised about seeing all of it bought down, but would love to see that half. And so that's a big variable for us to consider with our revenue projections. And we're hoping we can see and learn more of that really, really quickly. And we've talked with you about this before. The projected per pupil rates, that statewide average that came through in the governor's budget request is just over $10,400. Kind of true to form, Poudre School District, we are at about 95, 96% of that, and we look to have an almost $900 increase in per pupil rate next year at $9,957. Okay, that is all, it's review, but hopefully things that are still progressing through the School Finance Act process. Okay, on the screen is a table that's been shared with you before as well that reviews our funded pupils and averaging. At PSD, as a declining enrollment district recently, we're going to work on a 5-year average funded pupil count. And the important number here is really that 29,214.2. Hey, that's the number that we're building this preliminary budget off of, 29,214.2 non-charter students. Okay? And that's the same number we've been working with based on our district enrollment projections and also what's in the governor's proposal. And I'm going to go pretty quickly, and feel free to jump in with questions, and we'll obviously have an opportunity at the end for questions as well. Again, another table that we've shared before, where we compare the current year funded pupil count and the per pupil revenue versus what we expect next year. We're expecting that not quite $900 increase in per pupil rate next year, times that 29,214.2 students. And we expect to see our total program, which that's the basis, the bulk of our revenue, about 73% of our revenue, increase by about $24.4 million. A year-over-year increase, 24 and not quite $500,000. Again, this is off the information that came from the governor's revised budget proposal in January. Still the same data that we saw kind of progressing in the long bill, and hopefully we see in the School Finance Act. Okay, so that's the big pot of revenue, the total program funding. Okay, we have obviously revenue beyond that and above that, and we've got categorical increases. And in that long bill, that's the legislation that essentially sets the state budget. There are also some identifiers on increases in categorical funding. And so this is some new information since the last time we shared with you. We do expect to see about a 13.4% increase in special education categorical funding. For us, that would be about $1.1 million. And it's really, it's great to note that as recurring revenue added on to the categorical funding that was implemented this year of just over $2 million, now we're looking at $3 million of additional special education funding to help with implementing a new model and new allocations for staffing in our integrated services department. So we're excited about that. Transportation, we expect to see just shy of a 9% increase, about $190,000. And vocational education, about an 8% increase to the tune of $145,000. English language proficiency, a pretty large increase, 23.9%. And for us, that's $110,000 of additional categorical revenue. And gifted and talented, a 2.9% increase, which would come to about $40,000. So those are the categoricals on top of the program funding. And we're keeping it really high level here. So that's sort of the big revenue picture. And let's talk big expenditure picture right now. The biggest driver in expenditures we know is compensation. About 86% of what we spend is on people, is investment in our staff. Okay? And that process is ongoing through the negotiation process. A lot of people are working hard on dialing in what that's going to look like for 23-24. And we've got a little bit of, I guess, numerical multiplier data to share as far as what are some costs that the compensation committee and negotiations are going to be considering as they go through this process. And these multipliers apply to all of our employee groups, classified, administrative, certified. Okay, as we project into next year, we look at what would a 1% or what would 1% of a cost of living cost increase look like. That'd be about $2.5 million. So it's important to note that for each 1% of cost of living increase, we're adding on another $2.5 million. So if we got a 3%, got in that 3% cost of living range, we're looking at $7.5 million of increased compensation costs. Right? And this information, Dave did a great job putting this all together, sharing it with the compensation committee, and they're cranking, right? They're able to run scenarios and talk through things, and it's really cool to see that collaboration. And if we can picture in our minds that sort of traditional compensation structure in a school, the steps, moving down with years of experience. Each step throughout our employee groups would cost about $5.1 million. To move a step, going to cost just over $5 million. Okay, so those are those variables that now start to get factored into that available additional revenue. How are we going to match that with with expenditures and compensation, et cetera. Other things that we're analyzing as far as cost increases, okay, as enrollment changes, as revenue changes, our allocations to our charter schools also change. Those are on a pro rata share. And charter population this year made up about 9% of the district-funded pupil count. So about 9% of that would be an additional $2.4 million of funds allocated to the charters. Okay, that would take that number into the just shy of probably $34 million total going to charter allocations. And then we've got some TBDs still. You know, we still have some unknowns that we're working through, and they're going to be estimates for a while, probably, some of these. What are utilities going to look like? We're all feeling that at home. Right? How are those cost increases going to impact the district? We're working through some of that. Difference in our insurance premiums, okay, what the district pays to do business. Okay, all these costs of doing business things are going up, as we all can relate, the cost of fuel, et cetera. So we still have some question marks that we've got to work through in some of those other categories. So when we take that information and combine it into a table that's on your screen right now, we compare basically those big revenue categories with those big expenditure categories. That School Finance Act generating about $24.4 million of new revenue. That special education categorical increase of $1.1 million. One item that I haven't touched on yet is that we do have one of our mill levy overrides that grows with the rate of inflation. So our 2019 mill levy override will grow by that 8%. That's an additional $1.5 million of revenue there as well. So we factor that in, and we've got about $27 million of charter shared revenue. Then we start to take items out, that allocation to the charters of $2.4 million, and then we can add back in some of those other categoricals. We've got question marks, which usually isn't very good for an equation, right? You got a question mark for other revenue and utilities and insurance. We'll have some numbers in there, and there'll be estimates. But the hope really is that additional revenue generated in our specific ownership tax and in our investments will help offset some of those utilities increases, insurance premiums increases as well. Fingers crossed there. Bottom line, in this projection that is driving our preliminary budget, we're looking at $24.1 million available to work with for compensation, benefits increases that are potentially on the horizon, and other district priorities.
Before you go off this slide, could you tell us what that integrated services line means, increase in ratio allocations?
Yeah. Right down there at the bottom, the integrated service increase in ratio allocations of a negative $1 million. Okay, this year the IS department and worked really hard, especially in the spring semester, to adjust and implement a new staffing allocation formula, basically, that to work with all of our schools. And to get there, it cost about $1 million this year, but also that $2.1 million of the categorical funding that I touched on a little bit ago. All right, so it's costing a little bit more to redistribute that, but we knew that we had that additional categorical revenue this year, and we're banking a little bit on what we see coming in new funding for special ed next year.
So that 1 million there probably goes against this, the special ed categorical at the top.
Yes. Yeah.
Great, thank you. That
Yep.
clarifies it.
Thank you. So what are some items we're still watching besides the whole School Finance Act? Okay. Well, that's right there. We hear that hopefully that's to be introduced next week. And you know, Dave's he's pretty tight with the lobbyists and folks that have information. I think you all are too. So as we hear stuff, we'll get that recorded. Initially, last fall, there was a lot of talk about a potential formula overhaul, maybe even coming from different directions. And that's gotten really quiet. We just don't think we're going to see a big school finance formula overhaul. That's an incredible task. And so probably not happening, although there may still be modifications when it comes to cost of living and at-risk shifts. Big question marks still surround the universal pre-K and Healthy Meals for All. We do know that the long bill allocated $322 million statewide for the universal pre-K implementation. That's for preschoolers to receive that minimum of 15 hours of no out-of-pocket cost preschool. Hey, what our portion is, still awaiting what that looks like. Well, and then we'll get that figured out and estimated as well. And same with the healthy meals. We've a whole lot of hurry up and wait as far as some numbers, some of those. And then we're also curious to monitor the rapidly changing world of assessed valuation. It's a assessment year. Expect that AV rate is really gonna climb. And what will that do to the formula, right? If more local property taxes are funding the formula, that means less state equalization. That's pretty much the design of the 1994 school finance formula. But there may be opportunities or initiatives to offer some property tax relief to taxpayers and mitigate some of those increases. So we'll keep our eyes on those things as well. The district budget priorities, this is a review. I won't spend really time on these. A lot of great information, especially tonight on the literacy, and obviously significant resources being allocated there, and you are seeing the great things that are starting to happen there. The timeline that lies ahead of us, this Friday, our budget design team will convene again. That group is really instrumental in evaluating the district priorities. We're hoping, as I mentioned, for the school finance to act to drop next year, next week, next year as well. Negotiations next Wednesday, the 12th, along with another compensation committee meeting that day. And then back to you on the 18th with a preliminary budget. That's a draft. That'll be our jumping off point for our budget for fiscal year 24. Our budget advisory committee, that weighs in on some of those priorities as well, provides us some feedback. We're getting together with them on April 24th. Another budget design team group meeting on the 28th. Negotiations in May with the goal of having a proposed budget to you on May 23rd, and then budget adoption hopefully on June 13th. So it'll come fast, and a lot of information will really start flowing here soon. And this on the screen is the budget process timeline that we've been following throughout the year. It's hard to believe we're already trending toward the right end of that, and the year is moving quite quickly. With that, what questions do you have?
Do we have questions from the board? Not seeing any, Jim?
Nothing here, Rob.
Did you have any questions?
I said nothing here, Rob.
Oh, I thought, what it sounded like you said is, I'm here, Rob, so.
Sorry,
So-
got it.
Yeah, I have one question, and that is the cost of a COLA. Is that on top of this step? I mean, presumably the COLA is,
Yes.
yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So it's if you apply a step and then you do a COLA to it, it costs $2.5 million. Okay, great.
Correct.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It looks like that's it as far as questions are concerned. Thank you very much for keeping us up to date, and we look forward to the budget, the preliminary budget next time.